Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you are watching us on our YouTube channel, I am Will Wright, your political host, your faithful host. Pastor Josh Bertram unfortunately can't be here, but we have with us, returning from the depths of her writing cave, Professor Corinna Lain, who is here to talk about her book that is finally here, Secrets of the Killing State. And I'm not going to really do a very elaborate bio like I normally do. Instead, I'd rather you, Corinna, just talk about why you're so qualified to write this book, and then we'll get into what the book is all about.
Why you're so qualified. Well, first of all, it's so great to see you, Will. It's really good to be back on the show. I've been writing about the death penalty for over 15 years. And this book is the culmination of, at this point, it's 7 years of deep research into lethal injection. And I'm a legal historian, and there's some legal history in there, and Good. All kinds of things. So.
Yeah. So like what? Walk us through your personal, your professional journey. I know that you said you've been in this business for a while, and you are really qualified to write this. Maybe the question is why? Why write this book?
So I'll tell you how this book came to be. And there's different pieces of it, but I was writing a death penalty article. And the article I was writing, which I'm excited to get back to at some point, was called Disowning Death. And it was really about how the law and legal structures separate us from what the death penalty really is, and helps us to disown it. So nobody really owns it, and then somebody's dead at the end. And so it was sort of an A to Z piece, and the Z, the last bit of it, was executions. And so that's lethal injection. And I thought, well, of course, lethal injection is about disowning. It's so obvious. It doesn't even look like the state is, killing. It just looks like you're sort of drifting off to sleep. But who had shown that? Who? The states say, well, no, this is all about humane. And maybe it was, or maybe it wasn't. I didn't know when I first started. But, how are you going to show that a lot of this is disowning? So there's legal history in that, some other things, but I decided to start exploring it. And I kept coming to the question of why are they so bad at this? It's like,
yeah.
Right? We know how to put pets down. We know how physician-assisted suicide work. Why are they so breathtakingly bad at lethal injection? And so, that question was in there. And I started really researching it and started writing. I think I got to the end of part 1, and I had 300 footnotes and said,
wow.
It's a book. And I didn't want to write a book. I really, really didn't want to write a book. In fact, I had a legal history piece that I had put down. That piece is still down because people said, well, it really is more of a book, and I didn't want to write a book. So, I legitimately did not want to write a book. And I was at a conference in January 2018, and it's a law professor conference. So everybody's like, what are you working on? What are you working on? And it really stressed me out because I was stuck and didn't want to put another project down. And so at one point I, went back up to my room, skipped whatever the 1 o'clock session was, and just, got on my knees and was like, Lord. And I share this because it's faithful politics. So,
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a full testimony, but, this is how it started. Is I was like, Lord, I don't want to write a book on lethal injection. But if it's from you, then that would change everything. And there was a moment that followed that. And I'll just tell you, I reached over and to see if maybe there was like a Gideon's Bible or something like that in the hotel room. I didn't have one. And there was, and I just, opened it up. and it opened to Psalm 45, which I have like on in a little private place on my bulletin. So I'll read it. It said, my heart is overflowing with a good theme. I recite my composition concerning the king. My tongue is the pen of a ready writer. And that was the top left. And I was really praying, saying, you know, if this is from you, just speak clearly, because that would change everything. And so when I opened it, I was like, well, all right, you know, this could have been a series of articles. I could have put it down entirely. I'm going to write a book on lethal injection.
That's so wild. So how many different ways are there to actually, like, I don't know, kill a person within this system? And, you know, what is it about lethal injection that really kind of separates itself from the rest of the flock?
Yeah. I mean, there are a number of ways, and lethal injection is unique in that, you know, we don't have to see the sight of blood. We don't have to smell burning flesh. That's the electric chair. Sight of blood is the firing squad. We don't have to see people retching, and at least when it's not botched. But you know, as a matter of course, and gasping for breath and all of that sort of thing, which is the gas chamber. So we don't have to deal with any of the outward signs of violence.
And hanging? Is hanging still around?
There was one state, I think, that allowed hanging, but there's some sense that, I mean, nobody's hanging anyone anymore. But I'm trying to think of, I don't think a court ever said, well, that's unconstitutional. I mean, what has happened is that as these methods have become obviously torturous, they have also become obviously unacceptable. So there's some sort of almost unwritten proviso that in order to have the death penalty, states can't offend the sensibilities of the people in whose name those executions are conducted. And so once the brutality becomes clear, states move on to a new method. And I mean, that is just the story that repeats over time. And so the thing about lethal injection is that violence is internalized. And I think it's important to understand that executions are necessarily violent. Like, it takes force, it takes physical force, it takes violence to stop the heart from beating before it's ready to go on its own, you know, to end life before the body is ready to give it up on its own. And that's just, you know, that's just a state of nature. It could be a car accident, right? It could be a murder, it could be an execution, but it takes violence, it takes physical force to end life. And so the thing that's special about lethal injection is all of that violence is hidden. It's all internalized to the body under a chemical veneer. So it's not that the violence isn't happening, it's that we don't see it. It looks humane. It looks like you're just falling asleep.
Wow, that's crazy. Okay, so your book is called Secrets of the Killing State: The Untold Story of Lethal Injection, and it starts off with a bit of a page turner story, and I'd love for you to maybe talk to us about it. Was it Clayton Lockett? Is that the okay?
Clayton Lockett.
Tell us the story of Clayton Lockett.
How much time have you got? No, I'll try to make it quick. But
3 minutes.
Yeah, no, Clayton Lockett is chapter 1. And I start with that story. It's the only chapter that is like just the story of a botched execution. And I did that for 2 reasons. One was Clayton Lockett's botched execution. So this was Oklahoma. It was in 2014. And that was a long time ago, right? That was a decade ago, so people may not remember. But in 2014, it was one of the top 10 news stories at the end of the year, where they rank the news stories of the year. This was one of the top 10. It was a huge deal. And so the pressure was really on. And the governor at the time said, we're going to put executions on hold. We're going to have an independent investigation into what happened here. And she appointed her department, the head of her Department of Public Safety. So she appointed a member of her own cabinet to lead this independent investigation. And not only was he a member of her own cabinet, but it was the cabinet that was in charge of the Department of Corrections. And not only was that the case, but the person that was the cabinet member came out of the DOC, of the Department of Corrections. He rose up from the ranks. And he was there the night of the execution. So, in no way does a material witness in the execution that you're investigating, that make this an independent investigation. But the upside of having an insider do the investigation is that he talked to all of these people and they were downright chatty. And so we had, thanks to people who were collecting these and who got the files through litigation. And then I was able to get these, the transcripts, but I had over 3,000 pages of transcripts of interviews. And so I tell that story through the mouths of the very people that were a part of it. And it's completely different than what we get in the litigation setting, where you're very tight-lipped. So, I chose it for that reason. And then also it shows you this is what a lethal injection looks like. And so now moving to your question, it starts with, the drugs. How did they find the drugs? Well, it was the lawyer for the Department of Corrections who is Googling it. And he later says, well, I went past the WikiLeaks or whatever it was.
Oh my gosh.
And, so it's like just mishap after mishap after mishap. The equipment wasn't right. They couldn't access the vein. They end up sticking him over 14 times to try to get the vein. They bring a doctor in and they do a femoral, but it's not stable, and so they try to tape it down, and then they cover the spot so that the person who is monitoring the execution is the warden, and the warden's not a medical person. The warden, can only see when something goes obviously wrong, but even at which point it's too late. But even here, they covered the spot. So even when it was obviously wrong, nobody knew until Clayton Lockett woke up on the gurney and tried to get up off the gurney in the midst of his execution. And he's talking and witnesses are gasping. And so
was his lawyer there?
Who's
Clayton?
Lawyer? I'm sure he was. He or she. I'm not sure, but certainly that lawyer would have been there.
I mean, like, how do we get to a point where, like, people have executed others with lethal injections prior to this, I think. So how do we get from a successful lethal injection execution and on one person, but then a botched one on this one? Was this more administrative, or is this really kind of just the ugliness of the killing people business, in our justice system?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because before I studied it, I thought kind of the same thing. Well, we've been doing lethal injection since 1977, so why was it okay and now it's like seemingly blown up? And part of the answer is no, it was always bad. The very first execution by lethal injection, totally botched. And so if you go through time, and Austin Serrett's work has actually documented the botches, and has shown, well, the botch rate for lethal injection is and has been somewhere over 7%. So it's twice as much as any other method. So this is something that's been happening, but other things have come in and made those botched executions more salient. And so now we're starting to pay attention. So it's not like it was all going right and now it's not. It was always going wrong. I think of botched executions as the spillover effect of a system that's deeply, deeply broken.
Like a
And
botched execution is like the lagging indicator, essentially.
it's those are the things that go wrong that we see. But there is also suffering that we don't see. So we now know from national studies that approximately 84% of the people, this is shown by autopsies, approximately 84% of the autopsies of condemned inmates that are executed by lethal injection show that they suffered from acute pulmonary edema as they died. So a lot of those, everyone looks and is like, oh no, that wasn't a botched execution. That one went smoothly. No, actually they were drowning in their own fluids. You just didn't see it.
Is there a standard for, or a measurement for success? Because I think I've heard you say a few times, they considered it a successful execution, which I suppose if the end state is the person is no longer alive, then you could say 100% of the executions we've had have been successful. But is there some sort of standard?
Well, it depends on who you ask. But I do document again and again prison officials, executioners who say, well, that wasn't a botched execution because the person died. They died, didn't they? Well, that was the point, was to kill them. So that wasn't botched. And they're saying this, for example, after a 2-hour execution, and there's one case that I talk about in Arizona where it was, an hour and 57 minutes. And a media person asked a question and was like, how is a 2-hour execution not botched? And the DOC official walked away from the mic as he started asking the question. I'm just not going to answer that. So you and I might think of a botched execution as, no, they're telling us it's this. They're telling us it's humane. And when the person is obviously suffering, that's a botched execution. But, so much of this is happening that they are reframing what a botched execution is. A botched execution is, I guess when they don't die at the end. And now for lethal injection, we have some of those too, where people are surviving their own executions. And the state is going at it again.
This sounds like one of those, are they war plans or attack plans? Kind of scenarios where,
good point.
And in your book, you do make an argument to try to say that lethal injections, make it look humane. And you shared, example of kind of what it's really doing. Is that, are there other sort of ways that a person is suffering after they've, had the stuff put in them, that you think the public would really, benefit from knowing?
I mean, they're suffering in lots of ways. And, I think that starts with just having to access the veins. I mean, that is a problem, that is a recurring problem. And so we've seen numerous executions at this point where the executioners are trying to access the veins. And I mean, Clayton Lockett is one, over 14 times. We see 18 times, that they are repeatedly sticking this person. They
Can
are
I
going back to sites.
can I stop you just right there, because something came to my mind as you were talking about Clayton Lockett being stabbed like 14 times. Like, I can't remember if it was his situation, but didn't they do a neck thing? Like try to access the, can you talk about that?
Yeah. So they did. They tried to access the veins in his neck. They didn't have the right needle. Didn't stop them from trying, but they didn't have the right needle. And later doctors came in and said that would have been that's a really bad place to do a massive injection of drugs, because if it infiltrates, that is to say, if the needle pops out of the vein, or if it goes all the way through, if you end up injecting the drugs, into the tissue, which is exactly what happened with Clayton Lockett. But, if something goes wrong, and you've got a catheter in the neck, you can choke to death. And so, yes, that was Clayton Lockett. They just weren't successful in doing that, uh, particular insertion. But we saw it in it's the vignette that I use at the beginning of chapter 9 on Secrecy too. That's the one where they did an autopsy and they found tan-colored makeup covering a number of insertion marks into the veins, into the neck. So,
Wait,
all secrets.
I should at least just present some bit of a disclaimer for the show. If you see either me or Corinna sort of smirk or laugh, like, none of what we're talking about is funny. It's just like, it's more appalling. And I think our sort of subtle laughs are just sort of a representation of just how appalled we are. So like, if you're watching this and you're like, look at those two guys, they're just laughing at all the death. It's like, no. Like what you're talking about, Corinna, is just like absolutely ridiculous. So let's peel back that banana for a second, regarding the makeup. Tell us more.
I mean, I'm really glad that you paused and had a little note for our listeners, because I've had a number of people say, "Oh, I think this is going to be depressing," and then they read it and then they say, "Actually, it was infuriating." That's what it is. It's shocking and infuriating, and so that's the reaction of like, "Wait a minute, somebody put makeup over, tried to hide the number of insertions." Yes, that is true. Uh, there's secrecy in all sorts of ways. So I talk about what I call the state secrecy two-step. Step one, and I'm like, this is a dance around the facts. Here's the state secrecy two-step. Step one is, if something goes wrong, hide it, deny it. It's clean up on aisle 5. But step 2 is, and then do all you can to prevent, further spills from being noticed in the first place. So some of this is reactive, that's step 1, and some of this is proactive, that's step 2. And states use both. So, when something goes wrong, what we've seen is states will lower the blinds. We saw that in Clayton Lockett, but we've seen it in some others. Nebraska had one execution trying to use fentanyl. It was the only execution in the country. No one's repeated that. The guy started turning purple, and they just lowered the blinds.
Wait, somebody died because they injected them with fentanyl?
It was the world's only fentanyl. It was a 4-drug protocol trying fentanyl. And another state has toyed with that, but only Nebraska has actually tried to carry it out. And after Nebraska's disaster, no state has tried to go back to it. And so even as Nebraska, in that particular case, the inmate, the prisoner started turning purple. And media witnesses said the prison official who was in the execution chamber sees what's happening, says something into a mic of some sort, and the curtain comes down. And at first, Nebraska officials, they don't say anything about the fact that the curtain has gone down, but media witnesses are pushing. Wait a minute. And I think it opens, I can't remember, maybe 14 minutes later, and he's dead. Like, that's it. That's all you get. And later, Nebraska said, oh, no, that was planned. It was planned at that time all along. Nothing happened here. But do we know what happened behind the curtain? No. To this day, we do not know what happened.
Couldn't you sue or something to get somebody's testimony? Like, how does that work?
Well, on the front side, prisoners can sue under Section 1983. And a lot of the material that I have is from those suits and from the discovery that has come from those suits. In those lawsuits, they're not contesting their death sentence. So that's all separate litigation of whether or not their conviction is solid, whether or not a death sentence, so there's any irregularities there. By the time you get to the end, they're saying, yep, I'm not fighting that the state can execute me. What I'm saying is you're not allowed to torture me to death. And so there's those suits. We also have seen suits after the fact, after botched executions, where the family members of the prisoner has sued. Most of those are, all civil suits for damages for torturing the person. And even those are like, I'm not saying you didn't have the legal authority to kill them. I'm saying you violated the Constitution. You tortured someone to death. And so we do sometimes see those suits.
How did those suits generally end?
It's a good question because it's all like individual. I'm thinking of one in Alabama that I talk about in the book where this person survived his execution, was punctured numerous times. They punctured his bladder. He ends up in really bad shape, but he survives as they give up. They can't get a vein, so they give up. And he ends up suing, and they settled that. Alabama settled that suit, agreeing not to re-execute him in exchange for ending the suit and not disclosing anything that they found as a result. So, the line I have in the book is, the state that loves its pound of flesh loves secrecy even more.
Oh my gosh, Corinna. All right. The liquid, and I'm assuming it's a liquid for most of these lethal injections. Like, what's the story behind that? I mean, you mentioned one gentleman tried to Google what the product is, but like, if I don't even know what the name of somebody who works at the Department of Corrections whose job it was to execute people, and I had a prep for an upcoming execution, like how would I go about finding the chemicals that I want?
I mean, it's a great question because it highlights it's like, who is the villain in this story? Who is the victim in this story? Because the state legislatures pass these statutes that just say lethal injection, or they might use more words and say, death by a chemical substance or combination until death, something like that. But basically, most of these statutes just say lethal injection. Okay, so now it goes to the departments of correction. And these departments of correction, they're like, we don't know how to do this stuff. Like, that's not what we do. We're not doctors. So how are they going to figure it out? And so, one of the things I document is, well, what would you do if you got some task and you didn't know what to do? you would either Google it, well, we see that, or you would give it to somebody else that presumably knows. And so we've seen both of those things. We've seen lawyers Googling it, and we've seen departments of correction trying to give it to someone else. So Missouri found a doctor and said, you figure this out. And the doctor that they found had more than 20 malpractice suits filed against him. He was mixing and measuring the drugs, and it turns out, well, in litigation, they looked at the pharmacy logs for the last execution, and it was like, wait a minute, the state of Missouri is injecting half of the amount that's in the protocol. And the state initially came back and said, no, that's a mistake in the logs. The protocol says, this amount, and that's what we've injected. But we're checking to see why there was a mistake in the logs. So we'll be back to you. And then they come back the next day and say, we've just learned that actually is what happened. They were injecting half of the amount. We're going to get to the bottom of it as to why. We've gone completely rogue here. We're violating our own protocol. And the judge in that case says, I'm going to give the prisoners, the lawyers for the prisoners, a limited deposition to, it's going to be behind a veil. You're not going to know. We're not going to reveal the executioner, but we're going to allow you, this is your suit and you've uncovered something important. So we're going to allow this limited deposition. So they're talking to this doctor. They don't know who he is, but they're talking to him. And they're like, what is this all about? And he said, well, I'm dyslexic, so sometimes I mix up the numbers. He later said, I'm not dyslexic. I just have trouble keeping my numbers straight. But the bottom line was, the court in that case said, state of Missouri, you may no longer use someone, lethal injection is all about mixing and measuring correctly. And you may not use somebody who has problems mixing and measuring. And it's interesting because the state of Missouri in that litigation were sticking like glue. They were like, oh no, we have plenty of confidence with him. We're going to stick with them. We're going to fight this out. And they later withdrew that and said, yeah, okay.
Our bad.
Yeah, our bad. But by that time, investigative journalists, and hats off to them, I use a lot of their work in my book, but investigative journalists had found, wait a minute, he had over 20, who is this person who might be, who is dyslexic? And found that he had over 20 malpractice suits and had his hospital privileges revoked at 2 hospitals.
Like when I hear stories like that, I think of when I was in college. I worked as a vet tech for a short period of time, and I've seen more than my fair share of animals be euthanized. If I recall, I think they use something called like sodium pentothal to put somebody down. So like, why couldn't we just use the same drugs that we use for animals, like for humans?
I mean, some states do that today. That was not the traditional 3-drug protocol. And it was a question I had too. When I figured out what those drugs were, I'm like, wait a minute, not a single one of these drugs is the single shot of pentobarbital that we use to put down pets. What's that all about? Like, why did they choose these 3 drugs? And the answer was, a guy made it up off the top of his head. And that was itself a shocking moment for me, because I assumed we were using the same drugs that we use for animal euthanasia. For the first 30 years of lethal injection, we didn't. And B, I thought, well, surely there's some science behind lethal injection. Surely some guy didn't just make it up off the top of his head. But alas, that is exactly what happened. And, he was asked about, how did you come up with the drugs? And he said, I didn't do any research. I just thought about what was needed from being under anesthesia myself. This was Dr. J. Chapman. He was a doctor. He was the state's medical examiner for the state of Oklahoma. And he referred to himself as an expert in dead bodies, but not in how to get them that way. But he made it up. And, I talk in the, I talk in the book about like, well, why didn't, why, I mean, we don't know. I don't know, and I don't purport to know, but I do talk about like, why didn't he just use the same, like, why didn't he do that? And, either nobody asked him or I couldn't find his answer to that. But the facts are, he didn't, he either didn't know about how we put down pets. I mean, if one were trying to devise a humane execution by drugs, that would be the first question I would ask is like, okay, well, how do we put down pets? How does physician-assisted suicide work? Those actually both use the same single drug of pentobarbital. So like, I would have asked that question. Maybe he just didn't ask. He didn't think to ask it. Or maybe he already knew the answer. Maybe he knew that's how we put it down and just decided not to follow it. But, either way, it was clear that we were not trying to devise a protocol that was the same as what we put down pets because it was out there. It's not a secret, and that's not what we did. Now, by the way, it's worth mentioning that some states do use that single shot of pentobarbital now. Not all states, some do. And no state did that until the drugs, the original first drug in the protocol ran out. All of the states were saying, oh, no, we could not possibly use this single drug. That's what we use on, that's what we use on animals. And it's like, do you not realize that that is actually better than what we're doing for humans? But once the first drug ran out, they moved very quickly. Some did to that. But even now, for anyone saying, oh, phew, well, at least this is going to work itself out. No. Even when it's the same drug, it's a compounded version of that drug, not the manufactured version, like what is used in animal euthanasia. And it's a totally different ballgame.
It might be too early to tell at this point, but I am curious, just like, because you pointed out or identified areas of procurement where people got really creative because like they couldn't find the thing they needed, which was probably wrong anyways. But like given the current political economic climate we're in now with tariffs and what have you, like, is there a risk of people who work in this sector not having even a harder time getting the products they need to carry out these executions?
It's a great question, Will. I don't see tariffs playing into that because those drugs were coming from Western Europe, and Western Europe put export controls on every single drug that could be used for lethal injection. So they shut off that spigot a long time ago, back in 2010, 2011. So we're not, and then the other place that states have gone is to India. Well, those are black and gray market suppliers, and states did try to smuggle those drugs across the border. So I tell those stories. But the drugs were confiscated by the FDA because they clearly and unequivocally did not comply with the law. So so I don't see tariffs being a part of the story, but I love the way you put it, Will, when you said, states have really gotten creative with their drug procurement. That's a very polite way of saying it. But yeah, I document states have falsified prescriptions. They have taken bags and suitcases full of $10,000 and $15,000 in cash, crossed state lines, and bought drugs allegedly in a Walmart parking lot. But
Oh my gosh.
it's all been very under the table. And so, yes, they've been very creative.
It must be weird to like just watch people's reactions when you tell these stories that you're just like, oh yeah, like $10,000-$15,000 of cash in a Walmart parking lot to buy fentanyl to execute somebody or whatever. And I'm just like, what in the world? But this is your world, right? This is like the thing you've been researching for the past couple years. And I'm curious, like, what about the impact of the people that are involved? So like, we talk about all the folks in the room where it happens. Like, number one, walk us through like the line or whatever that goes into the person that has the stuff in it that will kill them. Like, how is that activated? Is it like a switch or button, electronic, or is it like random? And like, who gets to flip or push the switch?
I thought that the syringes were being pushed by doctors. I thought it was doctors actually administering this, or at least, some sort of medical professional. As it turns out, the syringes, who is pushing the drugs that are actually killing these people? It's non-medical prison guards. And I mean, I have to qualify that by saying we don't know in every single case. I mean, there's great secrecy around this, but I pieced together enough. And, so just by way of state protocols, the only place where there is any medical qualification at all is the people who are actually inserting the catheter into the veins. So, and that's one where it's like, yeah, you would need a medical person for that. Although, come to find out, non-medical people have actually tried. But by and large now, that is the one place, and the standards are incredibly low. So it is medical technicians actually doing that. You might have a paramedic or an EMT, or in some cases a phlebotomist. And phlebotomists are very good and experienced at taking blood, but in most states they're not even licensed to insert a catheter. And so, but as far as like who pushes the syringes, every place we know and every deposition I've seen, and even doctors who are involved, they're like, oh, wait, I don't push the drugs. That's done by the prison guards. So I have to qualify it by saying, some cases I definitely know, and wherever I have learned who is pushing the drugs, it's non-medical prison guards. But, it's all under the hood. It's all in the secrecy. And to your point, they're pushing the drugs from another room. So there's the room, the execution room, the execution chamber. And then there's a little anteroom that is next door. There's a hole between the two rooms where a tube goes, and it's generally 7 feet of tubing between the two. So you can imagine all of the complications that come from that. Clogs and kinks and all sorts of things. If you think about it, it's happened.
Wait, this is a tube like diameter of like an IV line kind of thing?
Yeah, it would be a super thin tube. And, but you asked also about what is the effect on those people. And so I do spend a good amount of time reporting people who have been interviewed and the trauma that imposes on them. And, there's one fellow who says, listen, every one of these autopsies says state homicide as the cause of death, homicide, or judicial homicide. And he said, that's me. When it says homicide, that's me. And you can't expect for people to be doing this as a part of their job, to someone who's not done anything to them. And as they themselves explain, by the time we execute someone, they've been living with us for 10, 15, 20 years. We've come to know them as human beings. And so over and over again, they say, you can't expect for me to do this job and not be affected by it. You can't expect for me to go home to my family and to be the same as if I didn't do this job. And so, this book, I don't make an argument in this book. This isn't the sort of book where I make an argument and try to convince you that I'm right. In this book, as you know, I just relentlessly document thing after thing after thing after thing. And I trust the reader to come to their own conclusion. But, it's really hard to read that, particularly that portion, and think, oh, wait a minute, we are creating a whole other class of people who are comfortable with killing. Or, as I also document, now departments of corrections, for example, in Oklahoma, have gone to the Oklahoma Court of Appeals and said, slow this down because we have to deal with the trauma on the backside. And I do quote one of the Court of Appeals judges who says, get over it, tough enough, buck up, let's go. And so I just lay it bare and let people come to their own conclusions about what we're doing and virtue ethics of what we're creating in the name of justice and in the people's name.
Gosh, I wanna switch to same topic. Just I don't even know if I can frame it as more lighthearted, but yeah. So the DOJ recently announced that they are seeking the death penalty for Luigi Mangione. He's the gentleman that shot the United Healthcare person. Can you just kind of walk us through, federal executions and that process? And I'm not necessarily asking you to take a side one way or another, but it's just like when I saw that announcement, it immediately made me think of you, because I'm like, oh, I can ask her about it. I can ask Corinna, what does that really mean? Do we still kill people at the federal level? And what would that execution look like in today's climate?
Well, I think one thing that we should keep in mind is if there's a death sentence on the backside of that trial, we're not going to see it for a very long time. A very long time. And so I think, yes, I can talk to you about executions. The last set of executions were the Trump executions in 2020, which, were fast-tracked once he lost the election. And the Supreme Court green-lighted those. And so we saw, I think it was 13, there were more federal executions in 6 months than there had been in, I think, the past 60 years. And so that's the last ones we saw. Of course, we know that Biden commuted almost all of the federal death row. But, I think what's interesting about this particular case is, there was a capital defendant that just pled out to life without parole in the El Paso shootings in Texas. More than 20 people, shopping at Walmart get killed. And, and so here we have the Trump administration saying, oh, we're going to go for death in this case. And the first thing I thought as a death penalty researcher was actually not about the execution, which again is going to happen in a decade from now. It could be totally different if it happens at all. It was about the very fact that they're going for death in a single homicide case. There are thousands of first-degree murders that happen every year. And so it's interesting to me that you're going for death here. Why? Why? Well, he's, was a prominent person. And it reminds me of the fact that if you kill a white person, you are more than 4 times likely to get the death penalty than if you kill a black person. We think about the racial disparities. I think most people think about racial disparities and they think about the race of the defendant. Well, some studies show that more than others. It depends. But the greatest racial effect is really whose lives are we more interested in achieving retribution for? And it's high status victims. It's high status victims. It's white victims over black victims. And so I don't know how much of this is in the conversation. Maybe it will be because of our podcast, your podcast. But, anyone who supports the death penalty, I wonder, but people could support the death penalty and say, yeah, but I don't think that people who are more prominent have more worth to their life than people who aren't. And so there's that disparity that I see. The other thing I thought, frankly, was good thing Dodge is on the case.
I believe it's
cutting government waste, because the single most wasteful government program, and I'll stand flat-footed on this, is the death penalty.
Really? Like it's really expensive?
Oh, yeah. And, at the federal level, just by way of like federal stats, it costs 8 times more just to try the case at the federal level than it does to try the case when death isn't on the table. So that, that's 8 times more. And you might not get a death sentence from that. You think about the shootings down in Florida, and they put that thing on multiple, over a dozen victims, and the jury came back with life. And so here you have somebody, yes, he killed a very prominent person. I think he's also crowdfunded. There are people who are like, yeah, well, every murder is a terrible murder, but I'm just saying, I think there's a chance that, you could put in all the money in the world and you may not even get that death penalty, and all that's down the drain. And then there's the cost of housing this person on death row versus, life without parole. So you would save millions upon millions of dollars by, calling it a day. We've got life without parole, which, you are taking their life. You're just saving millions of dollars.
So, okay. So, question. How do we fix this? Like you've mentioned that, this isn't necessarily like a book about the death penalty as much as it is about secrecy. So like, what do we do about, accountability in this space? Or is there anything that we can do?
I say at the beginning, this is a book about how we kill. It's not a book about whether we kill, But those two questions are not unrelated. And as I say at the beginning, I have my own views, but I'm going to hold those back. I want readers to come to their own conclusions before they ever hear from me. But by the end of the book, one of the things that I say is, frankly, that the story of lethal injection is a story about all the ways that states can't be trusted with this. I mean, it really does just ruthlessly document all the reasons states can't be trusted with the ability to take life and all the ways that they've tried to cover it up. So I think in the discourse, we tend to focus on one question. Does this person deserve to live? Does this person deserve to die? And when I look at it, I think, well, that's just half of the equation. The other question is, does the state deserve to take this life? And so that's, I think, a larger question that I leave readers with.
Yeah, because like I'm thinking, depending on where you're at state-wise, I mean, the information that you put in the book, like, talk a little bit about the difficulty or ease in which it was to find this stuff. So like, for instance, if me as just an average layperson, I pick up your book, I read it, I'm like, wow, that's really interesting. I wonder what our state's doing. Like would I be as successful as you were in trying to find the information?
I'm glad you asked, because I really do have to say hats off to the investigative journalists whose work is, I feature throughout the book. And so they've done a lot of the hard digging and FOIA requests and going over to India and finding out that Harris Pharma is just a guy named Chris Harris who left, gave the DEA an address that turns out to be his apartment that he left without paying 6 months rent. I wasn't going to be able to find that. So, in that way, I think little pieces of this story have been trickling out, for a decade or more. It just hasn't been put together. But so there's the investigative journalism piece. I found a lot of it in litigation documents, and some of those on a deep dive, I'm seeing beta documents that I can't get. And so some of that was reaching out to the lawyers and saying, hey, I know that you've got these documents, or can I get the expert report or something like that, where I wasn't able to get it myself, but they were filed. So they're there somewhere. And then a lot of this was reading, so the science, you've got competing experts. Some are saying this, some are saying this. Well, I want to see the scientific studies that you're referring to. So it's pulling all of that. And then a lot of times, at least at first, I couldn't understand the pharmacology, the pharmacological studies. So I'm pulling the pharmacology textbooks and I'm getting into that so that I can understand it. And so there's the whole, medical side. I think I ended up reading over 150 medical journal articles of on all sorts of, related in studies and the ethics and all of those conversations. And, then there was other scholarship that I'm pulling. And so it's not, some of this is literally covered by secrecy. And I talk about, for example, a state statute. I think that was Missouri that said you can't, we're not going to tell you this information. Okay, it's a secrecy statute. And by the way, if you find it on your own, and you repeat it, if you share it, you're liable for damages, including punitive damages. Another state says we're going to make you a felon for sharing this information. If you find out who the pharmaceutical producer is and you share it, that, you know, that's a felony. So a lot of this information was possible, but states have done every single thing they possibly can to hide it and not make it accessible to the public. You could do it. Investigative journalists have done it and have reported it at their own risk. But there are reasons why the American public still thinks lethal injection is basically a very humane thing that sometimes goes wrong for reasons we can't quite understand. That's not so.
All right. Last question-ish. If I consumed 3,000 calories, I'm gonna change as a person, good, better, and different. Like you talked earlier about you consuming 3,000 pages worth of information on a particular subject, and I know that's probably not the least bit of information that you've consumed. You probably consumed a ton, like we just talked about it. So, like, how has writing this book changed you? Because like it changed me just reading it, and I can only imagine it changed you as the writer. So talk to us about that.
Yeah. Do you want to see the piles? Do you like they're
Sure, yeah.
Let's see if I can do this.
For our special YouTube watchers.
I don't know if you can see all of that, but
yeah.
I have like just piles and piles and piles of information. I essentially at this point have an electronic library of all things lethal injection. It's it's a dark topic, and it's part of the reason I didn't want to write about lethal injection, and I didn't even want to write an article about lethal injection, let alone a book on lethal injection. It's one thing to write about the death penalty, and that can be depressing and dark in its own right. But, studying lethal injection is studying executions, and that is where the rubber hits the road, right? That's what the death penalty actually is. And so it is especially dark. And there's just so much tragedy. There's there's these, family members of the victim. There's the victim of the crime itself. There's the person who, I talk about this in the epilogue. Not always, but so often. 17 years later, they're not even the same person they were. They've redeemed. Some of them have started prison ministries, and so there's that tragedy. There's their family who have been going through this, and their family members have done nothing wrong, but are going to watch the state set a particular time and day to kill their family member. And then other people are going to file into a room to watch it. Right. And so you've got the trauma on the media. It's just, it's so much trauma. And so it was pretty dark. I do have some passages that I personally associate with oh yeah, I cried, or I had to stop and went over to my couch and cried. And, so there are some of those passages. But I think it was, really important work, and I would do it all again.
That's amazing. Well, you've got my commitment to finish your book, because as I've told you before, just talking, I was like, man, I can read a chapter at a time, and then I've got to put it down because then I want to break something. So yeah, just thank you so much for putting your heart and soul into the Secrets of the Killing State. Definitely can't recommend it enough. And do you have a preferred place that people find your book? Because this episode will be releasing on the day of your book release. So
love that.
where should they buy it?
You can buy it in any major bookstore. independent bookstores too.
Mhm.
If you're so inclined to support independent bookstores, I am embarking on a book tour. So right now we have dates. Politics and Prose in DC, Red Emma's in Baltimore, Making Worlds in Philly, and the co-op in Chicago. And then this fall, I'll be embarking on a driving tour, mostly around the South. But I do have a website. It's CorinnaLain.com, and events are all listed there.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I was going to ask you. That's really cool. You're going to be driving around your little Tesla Cybertruck thing.
No, actually, my sister bought a van in the last year, and when I told her I was going to do this kind of crazy thing, she basically said, "You're going to need somebody." I'll do it. So until she stops and like opens the door and kicks me out alongside of the road, she'll be going with me, and we're it's going to be the experience and the adventure of a lifetime for sure.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Well, definitely looking forward to hearing how that went. And as always, just thank you so much, Corinna. You're great. Gosh, what a heavy subject. But to our listeners and viewers, hey, thanks for stopping by again. And as always, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we will see you next time. Take care.